Lemonade, lemonade, lemonade.
Greetings, Gnomon class and everybody else who's watching this video. This is your homework and how you're going to be doing all of your homework from this point forward in looking for bones and muscles in this class, as well as the simple armatures. So this first stage is the armature stage. This is where we're looking for very simple shapes. The head is an oval, the neck is a cylinder-like shape, and this torso is a pillow-like shape, as I've explained in class as well as in my articles. You can see that I'm looking for a compressed side over on the one side and a stretched side. So just about every activity is like this when the body is leaning, bending, or turning. Afterwards, you go back in and define more specifically the difference between the rib cage and the pelvis, but at first you start with something really simple that's easy to measure. As well, on the bent side or the compressed side, you're looking for two equal halves between the upper and the lower half of the body. And this is again for measuring purposes. You want to keep everything measurable. The upper half is defining the rib cage, which is the absolute height of the upper half. The lower half has the pelvis and the oblique muscles in it that make up about the same height as the upper half. Then we put the legs and the arms on. And when we do, we're looking for minus muscles, which you can see I accidentally drew in that thigh muscle there, but I'll go in and shave it off a little bit later. The arms and the legs should be kept down to really simple cylinder forms, or two lines that taper down to the wrists and then down to the ankles. If we put the muscles on, then we're measuring from bump to bump, and in this case we're measuring action first and not defining any of the muscles so that we can really get the pose to be as active as we can possibly find. And then afterwards we're adding the hands and the feet onto the pose and making them very simple too, like you can see in the drawing here. Here I'm curving back around through the leg and I'm looking for what's called flexion. The flexion line is the curve of the leg and the arm as seen without muscles, so you know which way the arms and the legs are bending in space. If we put the muscle bumps on first, sometimes it can make the arm or the leg look like it's bending in the wrong direction or bending against itself incorrectly, causing the body to look a little distorted or broken, and that's what we're trying to avoid here in this first stage. Next, we're looking for the skeleton. So I've laid a piece of tracing paper over the top of the original armature, and I'm going to trace basically the head directly, because we're not going to do too much with that until we study the skull and the head, or the features of the head. Then I work down into the core, so we're looking at the torso now and defining the rib cage and the pelvis within that space. So from the head we put the spine on for the neck, and then we design out the rib cage. Now, because this is female, we're changing the direction of the arch within the abdominal wall. Instead of it being arched up and over, we're dropping it or draping it much like curtains that are closing. Once the rib cage has been defined and has some perspective to it, if the body is turned away from us in any way, then we continue on down that spine into the pelvis. And with the pelvis, I'm starting with a very simple oval. And I'm looking for that oval to have a pitch to it. That's what those lines indicate that are diagonal through both the rib cage and the pelvis. Now I'm going in and cleaning up the shape of it so it has a little more space between the rib cage and the pelvis. Then the next ellipse that I draw on indicates the front end and the back end of the pelvis. The little triangle is the tailbone. The two little dots in the front indicate the iliac crests, where a lot of the leg muscles are going to attach in the front. Connecting those to the pubis, you can see that little curve in the front, or three angular lines that make up the architecture in the front end where the abdominal wall is going to sit. Then we move on to the clavicles, and we piece those together with little bumps that indicate where they attach at the sternum and then where the acromion process is, so we can clearly see their ends. Then I'm putting in the scapulas, but very lightly so that they sit in the back of the body and not all of a sudden jump forward to the front of the body. And then putting on the humerus bones. That's what you see me building here. The little perspective cylinder that I put in at the elbow indicates the bumps on both sides of that bone, or the epicondyles of the bone. And that's the termination point of that particular bone shape. And they're in perspective so I can see which direction they are turned in space. Now the femurs, the next thing that I'm putting into the drawing here, have a very similar bump at the very base of them that is in perspective. It's kind of like a column shape, or if you were to put the tibia and the femur together, they would make up a box, and I'll show that here in just a moment. And I'm connecting those to the pelvis using circles, two sets. The first set is the great trochanter. The second set is the part that attaches it to the pelvis. Starting with one though, so that I know where the landmark sits with the great trochanter, and then the second one I'll put on later on as I need to build out the architecture of it more specifically. And this is the box shape that both the tibia and the fibula, or the fib and the femur make when we look at the knee space in perspective, especially when the leg is at length and not bent. Now we move down to the shin bone. That's the tibia. And we'll put that on first. And then secondly, the fibula will fit in there, and I'm making sure that the ankle bones have pitch to them so that the outside ankle bone sits lower than the inside ankle bone. And if we need to do a shorthand for that, all we need to do is draw a basic box that goes all the way down to the ankles, as I'm going to do here, one big shape all the way around. And then if we need the detail, which I'm putting in here, we'll go ahead and make the opening between the two bones. Now we put in the ankles, simple circles, and then the feet, which I apologize for cutting off. I actually thought those were in frame, and they are barely out of frame. Going back in and strengthening the lines, so the ones that are most important are the easiest to read, which means that anything in the back of the body I'm not going to darken too much because I don't want the whole thing to completely flatten out all of a sudden. Then we go into the forearms. And I'm putting on the ulna bone and then the radius bone. And just like the lower leg, we can put both of those together into one simple box shape first if we want to keep things simple when we first start the mapping process. But it is a good idea to see both bones separately from one another, so that you know exactly where they sit in space in regards to each other. As well, you know if the arm is supinating or pronating, which is rotating, and we'll get to that during the week that we cover the arms. And then finally put on the hands. And the hand shapes should be very simple, since we're not really looking at all of the bones independently right now, and we're not on the arms and their extremities. We're looking at just building a very simple graphic shape that indicates the action that we note. And then finally going back around throughout the body and strengthening all of the lines by darkening them in. And then the only real indication that I'm going to put into the skull here is the jawbone, the cheekbones, and then the nose. Just something so we know the direction that the head is looking in. And then finally, again, as I made note of, going around and strengthening up the shapes by darkening their lines, the lines that are most important for us to see. Now, earlier I said that you would make one set of lines lighter, the back lines, and the front lines a little darker, but here I'm actually making the skeleton very dark so that you can see it both in the demo, as well it'll be easy to see when we combine these layers together when turning in the homework, so that everything is visible from one stage to the next. This last stage is the muscle stage. So we're going to start with the pectoralis muscles up top, attaching them to the sternum, then to the clavicle, across the abdominal section, and then up onto the humerus, and making sure that all the lines are bending with the action. Remember that the lines are not static. we might see them that way in an anatomy book, but the body is in constant motion and all the muscles are forgiving in that respect, and they animate along just as much as the body animates. Here I'm looking at the clavicle and dividing it into thirds. 2/3 of the clavicle's length is occupied by the pectoralis muscle, and then everything attaches about 1/3 of the way up onto the humerus bone. Next, I'm going to be looking for the abdominal wall. I find the 2 corners below the pectoralis, the 10th ribs, and the iliac crests. Connect all of those together with lines, then down along the pelvis, around from the iliac crest along the pubis over to the other iliac crest. Now, because the model here is female, we're going to change the shape of that just slightly when we get more articulate with the shapes. Putting on the obliques, and the obliques are not just between the rib cage and the pelvis, but they go all the way up along the rib cage as well, and they do what's called interdigitate with the serratus muscles that come around from the scapulas in the back. So here is the shape change on the abdominal wall, making the lower half a little bit more dominant than the upper half, curving it right along where the navel is, and that would be the lower abdominal section. Then dividing each of the sections up, I'm going to be looking for 3 more sections above the lower abs, and each of these nicely enough goes out to a point off to the side of the body, almost as if you're looking at a box in perspective. And that also happens with the upper edge that meets the pectoralis muscles, but in this case I'm going to keep it really simple for this first exercise. And then one last thing here that I'm doing is I'm taking the edges of the obliques and I'm lining them up with the neck. That would be a part of what's called an abstraction, and that's just helping make everything fit together better. Then I'm going to go back in here, and what I'm doing is I'm building all of the striations in the pectoralis muscle, which there's about 5 or 6 of them. And what I'm doing is I'm just basically separating out the important segments of the pectoralis muscles. You have the clavicular portion that attaches along the clavicle. Then you have the sternocostal, which are those bigger sections I just darkened in there. And then you have the abdominal portion, which is that little thin sliver I'm working on now, right along that space. And each of those serves a slightly different function when the arm is in different positions out in front of the body. Now, the one change I'm making here on the abdominal wall, because this side is stretched, the lines are going to be further apart from each other than on the compressed side. So I'm just basically moving the point out a little bit further to the side of the body so that those lines will open up just a little bit more. And then finally here at the very bottom, we have the abdominal wall attaching at 2 little points along the pubis bone, but then the rest of it's the sheath that sits underneath there, the fascia that connects it firmly to the bone. Now, I'm going back around and I'm putting those little interdigitation lines in. Although we don't have any serratus muscles as of yet, I'm just going ahead and putting those little indicators in there so that we can kind of see what's going on there, that it's not just a generic shape, but there's actually a little more to it. And then this last stage, which you don't really have to do, but I'm doing it because knowing the direction that the muscle fibers are going in or moving in really does help a lot, especially when we put skin over the top of the muscles, because skin bends or creases perpendicular to those muscle fibers. It's a good idea to get in the habit of understanding which direction those fibers are going in, so that when you do crease the skin as you're inventing figures, you do it properly. And then the very last thing here is just to clean it all up and make it legible, so that when I go to scan all of these things in, all of the lines are nice and solid. So once you've drawn your pictures, then we scan them in. And I have all of these at grayscale right now, and eventually they will be converted over into RGB. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that all 3 of them line up with each other. So I drew these little registration points on both corners of each image, or all 3 of the images, so we could line them up. And the first one I'm going to line up here is the skeleton. So I'm going to Control A, Control C, bring it over, and Control V. I'm going to turn this blending mode into multiply. so we can see them overlapping each other, and then I'm going to drag the registration points over the top of one another. That's interesting. This one didn't want to line up at all. Let's see what happens when I'm not quite sure why those don't want to line up. That's interesting. You would think that the scans would line up better. Oh, there we go. Close enough. The skeleton fits on the inside of the pillow shape, or the armature that's sitting underneath. So now we have those two layers lined up with one another. I'm going to do the same thing here. Control A, Control C, Control V. Turn that into a multiply layer. Slide that into position. So we have all three layers lined up. So now we basically have all of the different layers stacked up on top of one another. And then the last thing I'm going to do here now is I'm going to take my file. I'm going to increase the canvas size to about, say, 14 inches. And I'm going to duplicate the bottom layer. Bring that up to the top, move it over here. Then I'm going to duplicate the skeletal layer. Bring that over. And actually, I really don't need to, because what I did here, if you notice, I drew, after the fact, I drew the scaffold back around the skeleton. So let's omit that previous layer, and I'm just going to have this one next to the other over here. And I can probably shut off my background layer as well and just keep these two overlapping one another. So we're in okay shape there. But what I am going to do, I'm going to go back to my background here, and I'm going to Control A and fill, which is Shift backspace. I'm going to fill the whole layer white so we can see both of these nicely. And then I'm going to take this layer and slide it over just a bit so that the two overlap each other and get them close to one another. So this is how you're going to turn in your assignments, with this on one side and this on the other. Then let's go to a new layer. Let's set the blending mode to multiply. Take the file, go to RGB, and I'm not going to flatten the file. We'll zoom in on this, slide it over, and then with 3 different colors, starting with red, we're going to identify each of the muscle sets. So let me, oops, go ahead here and colorize. And the nice thing is that because we're on blending mode, I can go out of the lines. I could be a little messy here. That isn't going to concern any of us here, because we can always go back in and trim it down, which I'm doing here. Just erasing out all the excess that doesn't need to be. I see something here that needs to be rectified. I need to take, I'll take this layer and this layer, and I'll scoot them both up so that they're resting on the clavicles. Get back up here, erase out the excess that has now overlapped the clavicle. Alright, so pectoralis in red, and we'll just go kind of a gradation of the warm family. Going to paint the abdominal wall, not with an eraser but with a brush. There we go. In orange, so we can see that one. And then finally we'll paint the obliques in yellow. And now we have ourselves a nice color-coded, organized muscle chart. And this is how you will want to turn in all of your anatomical studies for class. And let's do one more thing over here. Let's go to blue. And what I'm going to do on this side is I'm going to go ahead and draw in all the negative space, this blue color, so we can see the difference between the skeletal system and the space that we have left over for the armature. And at the very end here I'll label everything so when turned in it's easy to identify. That's where bones are, so we'll leave that be. Come down here and blast in a big